Hello, it's Amy. I've been reading some more of The Human Comedy by Honoré de Balzac. And this weekend, I sat and read from the third volume here, a novel titled A Start in Life. And I think I found my new favorite work by Honoré de Balzac. At least my favorite of the ones I've read so far. I have, high hopes for Lost Illusions, which I'll get to eventually as I read through. But what I've read of Balzac so far, this one is by far my favorite, just in terms of the structure. I would say it's framed almost perfectly. You have this thread, this setting, this place, and these characters that tie together the entire story at the start and then at the end. And it's got the perfect humor. It almost reminds me of the kind of wit you would find in, Shakespeare or Dickens or that kind of thing. And it reminded me a little bit of a later work by Flaubert. And I do wonder, if there was some sort of inspiration drawn from Balzac there. But it was just perfectly structured, humorous, and an interesting and fun story to read. So A Start in Life refers to the desire of a mother to basically get her son started in life. And so we begin with this, scene of an assortment of characters, an assortment of people waiting to take a coach, waiting to take a carriage from one rural area to the next. And we begin with Peroton's coach service. And we're introduced to him and to the, specs of his carriage and how he, squeezes in more people than the carriage is meant for and squeezes in more people than he's legally allowed to carry. And, how he gets around taxes and saves himself money and how he's overexerted himself in terms of purchasing a new carriage. He owes 1,000 francs and he doesn't have that money and they won't give him the carriage, which he's already put 2,500 francs down for if he doesn't pay that 1,000 francs immediately. And he is in danger of actually losing that money and the new carriage, despite the fact that he's, putting on some grand notions and telling people about this carriage, telling them it's going to be on the road come Monday, when he really has no means of getting this 1,000 francs and no one to borrow it from. Enter onto the scene a servant of the Count Savini, I think is how you would pronounce that name. But enter onto the scene the servant of a count who comes and tells him that the count is going to be taking his carriage, which is very unusual because normally the count would travel by his own carriage. But the count is headed to his estate in the countryside that he doesn't visit very often because he's been informed that the servitor, basically the property manager, the person he's left in charge of it, is, skimming some money off the top for himself, building himself a fortune, using more resources than he's entitled to, and that he's got some sort of scheme going on in which he will, convince someone to, sell some plots of land, shift some real estate around, and that will disadvantage the count, who ultimately, wants that land for himself. And it will benefit the servitor, Monsieur Murnau. And so Mr. Murnau and his wife have basically been living, as the grand lady and the grand gentleman off of this estate, despite the fact that his wife is, nothing but a lady's maid, but she doesn't like people to, point that out or remember that. And so they've been living, as important members of society in this rural district. And as the count is planning to, move and retire to this estate with his younger wife, who he's very much in love with. They're doing renovations. As this is all happening, of course, the servitor, the guy who's been looking after the estate, is getting very, very concerned about, what the arrival of the Count is going to mean for their position and their ability to keep, skimming some money. And in the midst of all that, the Count is, sneaking aboard this, public coach to go out to his estate and surprise them, instead of coming by his own, 4-horse carriage. And so he's traveling under an assumed name. Nobody else in the carriage knows who he is. And then comes our main character climbing on board. His mother brings him along. And his name is Oscar. He's 18 years old. And I just want to make sure I get the name of his mother correct here. Madame Clapart. So his mother, Madame Clapart, was once very wealthy and had position in society. Her first husband died. She remarried. Her second husband doesn't earn very much because he's only been working in his position for a short period of time. There's not going to be a pension available to him, once he's forced to retire from old age, from ill health. And her new husband doesn't really like Oscar. Thinks Oscar is a little bit, not very bright, a bit of a troublemaker, lacks discretion. And so his mother, Madame Clapart, is sending Oscar, 18-year-old Oscar, on this coach to go to Monsieur Moreau, who is, the servitor of that estate, who the Count is surprising. She's sending Oscar to him because Monsieur Moreau is a bit of a benefactor for Madame Clapart. And he is going to, teach Oscar a few things because Oscar is kind of useless. He doesn't know how to hunt. He doesn't know anything about, existing in society of any kind. And Oscar has been brought up on these grand stories of how his mother used to live and hasn't really seen, this real wealth. And so Oscar becomes, almost embarrassed and jealous of some of the wealthier looking people in this coach. And then you have a couple of artists climb on board and one or two other people. And they're all crammed into this coach, traveling across the countryside to get where they are trying to go. And as you do, or at least as they did in these days, these days we have our cell phones, we have all sorts of tablets and laptops and devices in our music. So at least in North America, you don't really talk to the strangers when you're taking public transit. But in these days, and I think we are looking at the 1820s when Balzac is setting this story. In the 1820s in France, he describes how there would be, this period of silence and kind of awkwardness as the passengers kind of size each other up and decide on people's, wealth and social status and what they might do for a living. So there's this brief period of awkwardness and then people begin to talk. But everybody is humbugging each other. And I do wonder, what the translation, because obviously humbugging is the English word that was used in this, 1900 set I have. So an English translation from the 1890s, from Ellen, Marriage, and Clarabelle, that's my set. I do wonder, what the translation of humbugging was, because humbugging isn't really a word we use all that much anymore. I think you only hear humbug, when you're talking about Scrooge in A Christmas Carol, but humbugging seems to be translating to this idea of, telling tales, jesting, I guess, it's sort of this state where you're making up tales. You're making up tales. You're not being truthful, and maybe you're doing it in a funny way. You're not meaning to cause harm, but everyone, we get the perspectives of these different people in the carriage. Everyone is, sizing each other up, feeling a little bit inadequate, and deciding to tell tales. And so we have these painters who are making out to be these famous artists who are on their way to paint the ceiling of this grand lady, and they're not going to be able to sign it because, she's one of their mistresses, and, they're off to do that. And you have the one guy who says, he's been, in the Middle East and in Africa fighting battles and meeting famous people and being given, gifts of like giant chests of gold and women, and how, he met with disaster and lost his fortune and was saved by this person of political importance. And then Oscar, who is the character we're following throughout this novel, makes an enormous blunder, because he too wants to be perceived as important. He's perhaps not seeing that everyone else isn't telling the truth. He's not seeing that he's not really, amongst the wealthy and the powerful and the influential and the great. And he doesn't want to be seen as, I won't say impoverished, but he doesn't want to be seen as someone of little wealth, as someone of little importance. And so he makes up a story. And then he starts talking his mouth. And of course, we have the Count sitting there the whole time. Nobody knows he's the Count. And Oscar says something which kind of it's kind of the last straw, the final nail in the coffin for what the Count is about to do. And everything falls apart. And Oscar's mother is devastated because she wanted to get him a start in life. And so they must make a new plan. And over the course of the novel, we switch from, this carriage scene, I would say that's kind of act one of the novel, to the rest of the novel, which is Oscar trying to find a different path to success. And we see him, conquering his first fault, which is a lack of discretion, conquering... and I think, Balzac sums it up nicely. It was actually refreshing to see how he closed it, because I had been thinking throughout, his lack of discretion, and then disciplined in his honesty. And I hadn't really thought about that because, Oscar tells some tall tales, but perhaps, honesty wasn't quite the thing that stuck out to me. Rather, it was his lack of discretion, his lack of judgment, as happens to a lot of Balzac's protagonists. He does have a brush with gambling, particularly with gambling with money that he doesn't have. He gets caught up briefly in this world of society and kind of the rush of drunkenness and gambling in a party. And so he's got to learn to have, some restraint in that area. And ultimately, he needs to learn what kind of man he needs to be, and, how to be, restrained and correct and productive, and how to really show that discretion. And ultimately, I won't tell you how, but ultimately, by the end of the novel, he does. And Balzac brings us nicely back to Perotin's coach service at the end of the novel, where Oscar is once again taking this coach service. And we have this, moment of reconnection where Oscar and us as the reader get to reflect on just how far Oscar has come, and, the various catastrophes and successes that have occurred in the lives of all these characters that we've seen over the course of the novel. And as I said, I think it's one of the best structured novels that I've read by Balzac so far. Some of Balzac's works, especially, the shorter ones, they almost seem like they weren't well thought out, which that could very well be the case, knowing how Balzac wrote. He was writing to pay his bills, he was writing quickly, he was writing in a haphazard motion sometimes. But this one really seems well thought out, well structured. There aren't really any loose ends that leave you wondering. It all seems as though it flows and is connected properly. Even though, the second half of the novel is a little bit different in terms of, setting and pace in the first half. It does seem like one work. It's not like with some of Balzac's novels where you feel as though Balzac wrote this scene and then decided that it needed to be a full-length novel, and so kind of copy and pasted something on that doesn't really seem to jive with the rest of the work. And Oscar, Oscar isn't likable, but he's not unlikable either. You see in him sort of that familiar folly of youth, and you can, kind of chuckle at his misfortunes. And there were a couple of moments where I was like, oh my God, Oscar, don't do that. Whatever you're about to do, don't do it. Just don't do that. And it was quite satisfying to see that at the end of the day, everything turned out okay for Oscar, and everything turned out okay for his mother. And perhaps, the bit of side joy you get is realizing that Periton and his coach service did not go into bankruptcy, or he was able to survive as well, and is still there running his coaches at the very end of the novel. But that's that. That is A Start in Life, one of the novels of Honoré de Balzac. And as I said, one of the, if not the best work by Balzac that I've read so far. But as I said, there's a lot of Balzac left to go, and I'm sure this will be challenged as my favorite as I continue to read on. But we'll leave it there.